Шановні колеги, всім
Greetings to everyone. The UCMC continues its work. The topic of the next press conference is how the courts punish those who take bribes after the Revolution of Dignity. Our speakers are Fedir Oryschuk, Director of Online Source of Trials, Iryna Rybakova, Analyst of Transparency International Ukraine, Oleksandr Maistrenko, Chief of the Special Actives Department, Judicial Division of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, Oleksandr Banchuk, expert of the Center for Political and Legal Reforms. Mr. Oryschuk, you're the first one. Good afternoon. What we want to present today is the research of the sentences for getting bribes during the period of time of March 2014 and February 2016. These are the sentences of the courts in times of new authorities. All the sentences which were on Article 368, getting illegal profit, all these sentences were examined by us and analyzed. We wanted to find out how our courts are loyal or non-loyal to corruptionists. The data that we present today, I believe we will try to provide comments, but they are quite evident. The preliminary conclusion is that the bribes, the amounts of bribes went up. Even though the authorities are saying that we are first of all combating corruption, but looking at the sentences, I'm talking about fixed bribes. The bribes go up, and there might be many reasons to that. One of them is probably the exchange rate, and the corruptionists, when they mention what amount of money they would like to get, they are probably quoting these amounts in dollars. So I will start from the average amount of the bribe in 2 last years went up by 30%. In 2014, the average amount was about 30,000 hryvnias. In 2015, it went up to approximately 40,000 hryvnias. There's one more interesting thing. The average amount of the penalties last year was even lower than the average amount of the bribe. So it looks like the courts in general, in average, it's difficult to call it punishment. People were demanding to get more money than the penalty, the amount of the penalty. Another example, out of 5 suspect, those who were suspected in giving bribe, in getting bribe of 1.5 million hryvnias, only one finished up in the prison. Others were not. How many sentences were there passed? About 1,000. How many criminals, how many of those who were getting bribes were at the court? More than 1,000, because there were sometimes more than one person involved into a crime. We were analyzing the sentences the rulings of the courts of first instance and also the courts of appeal to understand how the courts were treating corruption.
Насколько важно это уточнение?
Approximately out of the total amount of 1,000 rulings, 60 were the rulings of the courts of appeal. And that now I would like to give the floor to Iryna, and she will tell you in more detail about the result of that study. The main indicators of our research are only 1/5 of bribers are put to prison. 9% of the bribers are not are receiving the justification ruling, and others they get either conditional term. As to the bribes, last year we saw quite an interesting trend. The total average amount of the bribe was more than the average amount of the penalty. The average amount of the bribe was 22,000 and the average amount of the penalty was 19,000 hryvnia. So these penalties were sometimes lower than the bribes, and they cannot be considered fair. In 2014, it looked somewhat different. The average bribe was 9,000 and the average penalty 22,000. So it looks like the bribes go up together with the exchange rate and the penalties do not go up. Now the politicians are saying that we are fighting corruption, combating corruption, but we are seeing the opposite. The figures show the opposite. The bribes went up, and the average amount of the bribe went up in 2014. If we talk about the total amount of bribe, it was 16 million hryvnias. In 2015, 19 million hryvnias. So the volumes go up. One more interesting trend. The bigger is the bribe, the more probability is that the bribe will not be put to prison. The average amount of the bribe when received by a person who did not end up in the prison was 90,000 hryvnias. And the average amount of the bribe for which the person was penalized was 15,000 hryvnias. And the average bribe for which the criminal was put to prison is 85,000 hryvnias. So looking at these figures, the more money the briber receives, the more probability there is that he or she will not be put to prison. Also, some other figures. The average term of imprisonment is 4 years, 7 months. According to Article 368, the maximum term is 12 years of imprisonment. But during these 2 years, not a single person received that term. The probation period is 2 years, 2 months in 2014, 2015, and the average amount of the penalty is more than 20,000 and the average amount of bribe is 35,000. In 2014 that is 30,000 and last year that was 40,000. And where do the bribers work? The more of them are from law enforcement bodies. 14% of all those who were sentenced, that is more than 1,000 cases. And the widest type of a bribe is for closing by investigators the case. The second one is the land sphere. It's 10% of the total amount, and most often the civil servants were getting bribes for allocating land plots. 8% are related to medicine, 7% to science and education, 7% related to real estate, 6% to tax sector. It was interesting to calculate how many cases were opened against the judges. That is just 1%, but we believe it is not because the level of corruption is so low in courts, but because the cases against judges very rarely get to the courts. And Fedir will continue the presentation.
Just one more specification. It was not that 1%. It's not about the open cases. Not about open cases, but this was not. This was about those judges whose cases were filed to court finally. Also, there is no established practice in courts to punish bribes. For example, 17,000 hryvnia, that's standard fine. And we can look in more detail to whom this amount of fine is applied. 17,000 hryvnia were applied to those who received bribe less than 1,000 hryvnia bribe. The same 17,000 was imposed upon head of the transportation service on railway in railway sector, who received more than 25,000 hryvnia bribe. Also 20,000 bribe of 20,000 briber received 17,000 fine, and this spread shows that there is no logic in court when they apply 17,000 hryvnia to offenders who took 1,000 hryvnia bribe and to those who took up to 25,000 hryvnia bribes. Also, there is a category of verdicts for bribes in result of changing the article 368 changes its classification from bribe to just fraud, which is under Article 190. Quite often this is abuse of power. Article number 364 because those articles about fraud and abuse of power, they provide for easier punishment. For example, the militia officer closed criminal case, and in course of taking bribe, he was dismissed from this position. Actually, this could be classified as fraud. That is, the officer was dismissed from position where he could influence the investigation. Why it is better to be the fraudulent officer instead of a briber. For example, one bureaucrat received $67,000 and in line with Article 368, Part 5, he had to receive up to 6 or 8 years of in jail, while when his case was classified in line with the Article 190, fraud, he received just 2.5 years of probation. Just another example, when a briber, in course of requesting for a bribe, he was dismissed, and this again was classified as fraud, and he was just punished with several years of probation. About bribes for closing criminal cases. In average, closing of criminal case, we found around 60 such cases, and the standard, so to say, bribe is at the level of 15,000 hryvnia. The exact figures may deviate, but nevertheless the average is like this. Iryna mentioned the average amount of bribe, the average sum of bribe. Also, we calculated the average sum of bribes taken by corruptioners, taken by those who later received probation period and who were then accused in bribes, etc. And we came to the conclusion, which Iryna mentioned, that the more bribe you take, the less fine will be imposed upon you. And the last that I would like to add, we have made a rating of the top 12 biggest bribes for which people were either sentenced to something, or they were accused, or they were liberated. And I will provide several examples. The Director Generals of the Municipal Enterprise Kalinivsky Market, who took bribes to allocate merchandise kiosks in the market. The deputy head of the land agency in Mykolaiv allocated some 15 hectares of state lands two deputy mayors, the then deputy mayors of Melitopol, who requested bribes from automobile carriers. They received. They were punished with 1.5 million fine. They requested 1.5 million bribe. And that confirms what Iryna said, that nobody received 12 years of imprisonment. Maybe this is extremely severe punishment, I do not know, but actually in our legislation we have a very broad spread and very broad spectrum of punishments, and everything here depends on the investigators and law enforcers, as well as judges and prosecutors. They have many opportunities to manipulate with all that punishments. Now I would like to give the floor to Oleksandr Maistrenko, who is chief of the Special Activities Department.
The main types of activity of Anti-Corruption Bureau is fighting corruption, and the time of and the National Bureau has been operating for 4 months, but in the National Bureau we have more than 10 criminal cases where the suspicions were submitted to the persons, and these cases are at the stage of judicial investigation, documentation. Now at the National Bureau we have 12 criminal cases, 8 are against judges and 4 against the representatives of the national police and law enforcement bodies. 3 have been already transferred to the court, 4 including the case versus Buran, that is at the stage of the pre-judicial investigation. The problems in legislation do not allow to apply to the workers of the judicial system such a method as taking detainment, detention, and the representatives of the prosecutor's office, they have to pay the pledge, which is from 50 to 80,000 hryvnias. As to the size of the amount of the bribe, the lowest is $800, and that is the judge of the Kharkiv court, and the biggest one is the judge Buran, is 500,000 hryvnias. Also, we are preparing the case in Ternopil region, and that is the workers of the National Police of Ternopil region. There were 4 suspicions presented, and the case is prepared for submission by the end of 2016. We hope there will be first sentences made. The biggest problem now, and that does not allow to fight effectively. That is the impossibility to detain the judge, because that does not allow gives the person the chance to avoid the punishment. Besides, that was the problem of the National Bureau, and unfortunately we have a legal leak of information, because when the judge issues the sanction for search, he has to include this ruling into the National Register of Rulings, and every judge has access to such a register. So that is practically the legal leakage of the information that allows in the future to avoid such measures, because detectives come to the place where they have to, for example, confiscate something or make a search, the materials, the documents disappear. Now, the law department of the National Bureau submitted proposals to introducing the amendments as to this position of submitting such data into the National Register. And the National Bureau supports the initiative that the pledge cannot be applied to people who are accused according to Article 368, 369, so that the person cannot avoid punishment. The main result. The main problem is, or the main, the major, the thing that could resolve this situation is to introduce amendments into the legislation. Oleksandr Banchuk, please speak not fast.
Many things were already mentioned, and I would like, nevertheless, speak about positive things and later add something negative. When we look today at the news events, probably you would notice that Anti-Corruption Bureau had started its active work. Some other law enforcement agencies, like police, like prosecutors' office, like the security service of Ukraine, actually every day shows some arrests or detentions based on the anti-corruption cases. This suggests that current situation is improving because anti-corruption bureau proactivity pushes other law enforcement bodies to some actions. Each Ukrainian citizen can imagine the huge level of corruption, and when we look at those who were punished, who were sentenced in result of criminal case, in result of anti-corruption cases, these are not top corruptioners. They are not representing the ministries. They are not representing the central governmental bodies. They are not representing top government officials, while people believe that there should be such people among them. Also, despite all that big number of people sentenced to punishment for corruption, we understand that even judges do not believe that corruption is a very serious crime. Of course, they won't say this in public, but decisions made by courts and the severity of punishment, so to say, it proves that judges really believe that a bribe, it's not a murder, it's not a straight treason, it's they take it just as a minor violation, or better to say that person was so unlucky to be caught at the moment when they committed some corrupt actions, and those court verdicts which are not insufficient, which are insufficiently severe, that mild punishment, it supports actually the current level of corruption, and enforcement of those court sentences, court decisions, let's assume that each year 100,000 court decisions are made, and some percentage of those court cases result in positive court decisions, while all the bigger part of that court proceedings, they result in negative court verdicts, in negative court decisions, while in cases with bribes, the majority of cases result in full liberation of the accused persons. That is, this proves that all the evidences or materials collected by investigation nevertheless do not convince the judges that there was a criminal bribe, there was a bribe, there was an act of corruption, and this year 10% of these cases resulted in this. That is, the statistics for anti-corruption cases is absolutely reverse to the general statistics of accusations in the entire court system. Also, I would like to mention court decisions about judges which are posted in the state register of court decisions. I think that we should request from the Council of Judges that they should change their decision.
Відповідно до рішення Ради суддів України, вони визначають перелік судових рішень, в тому числі ухвал слідчих суддів, які потрапляють в реєстр, і строк, коли вони потрапляють. І тому, я думаю, тут потрібно просто вимагати, щоб або через звернення, щоб справді з певним запізненням відповідні ухвали, нехай вони потрапляють, але після завершення відповідної процесуальної дії. Тобто тут, я думаю, не потрібно залучати аж там Верховну Раду до цього питання, тому що зараз закон про доступ до судових рішень дозволяє це. А друга річ, про яку ви сказали, тут я
And the second thing that you mentioned about the problems, the existing problems, about the impossibility to pay a pledge for the accused person. I think that in the corruption cases, we should immediately detain accused people. But unfortunately, we cannot introduce this provision to our legislation because in the Court of Human Rights, this may be disputed. The person who is accused in corruption, who is suspected in committing corruption, could not be immediately arrested. There is a possibility to pay pledge. We used to have this practice by 2001 when this decision was made purely by the prosecutor. So this is in conflict with the European standards. I would like to suggest the following, that the courts which always request for the most serious limitation of freedom should not impose should not take a decision about arrest each time. They should make a decision about electronic arrest. They may make a decision about confiscation of the foreign passport from this person. So I think our courts should be more creative in limiting the freedom of movement for corruptioners. That is what I think is possible for the regular prosecutors everywhere. And two last things. When we speak about persecution of the corruptioners, I believe that from the next year, when National Bureau of Investigations will start functioning, we will have more anti-corruption cases against middle-level bureaucrats, so to say. And we should think about establishing new anti-corruption court. Currently, we have anti-corruption bureau, anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and maybe we should create anti-corruption court. This might be a collegium of the higher specialized court, and in this case we would be able to ensure that the anti-corruption bureau work, the anti-corruption prosecutors' work will result logically in something sensitive for those persons who committed corruption acts. That is what I wanted to mention about positive expectations. Thank you.
Now, Q&A session. If anyone has questions, you're welcome. Please introduce yourself. Evgenia Kovalenko, Channel 24. You were talking about the possibility to organize anti-corruption court. Who will do it? How will it work? When is it possible? There is an expert discussion going on that. And the position of Transparency International Ukraine and Anti-Corruption Group initiative of RPR is to initiate this discussion.
Зміни до закону про судоустрій, статус суддів. І, очевидно, в межах нинішньої Конституції це може бути
This could be not as a separate specialized court, it could be like a specialized collegium in the high specialized court, such a format. But the problem is that we need to introduce amendments to the legislation, and also who will we be selecting as judges. Now, the experts understand that we do need such an initiative, but it is not the law yet, or the draft law, the concept.
ось такі з приводу створення цього.
Колеги, чи є ще питання або уточнення?
Any other questions?
Ємець Марія, Український користувач.
Yemets Maria, UCMC. Maybe I'm mistaken. I heard two different figures as to the average amount of the bribe, 30,000 or 22,000. The average was 30,000 in 2014 and 40,000 in 2015. And 35 is average between these two.
Чи є ще питання уточнення?
Any other questions? Once no, then let's wrap up the press conference. Thank you for coming and see you again. Thank you.